Can you guys hear me okay? Great. So we're going to try things a little differently today. As I mentioned at the top of worship service, it's my birthday, so I'm going to do what I want. Isn't that how we usually do things, right, on our birthdays? We're accustomed to getting things my way. Instead of rising up for the reading of our Gospels passage, I'm actually going to keep us all seated. And before diving to the prescribed Gospel reading for today, I want us to look at the entirety of chapter 18 in Matthew, where the lection comes from for us. So if you would turn to your pew Bibles and going to the back in the New Testament, it's located on page 18. So page 18 for the 18th chapter of Matthew. Holy and living God, would you be with us today as we seek to turn our hearts to you, to consecrate our lives to you, to see the ways in which we are not walking in your light. We know that there is no darkness at all before you. Illumine our eyes so that we might see the ways in which you're calling us back to you. Good and gracious God. You are our Lord, our rock, and our Redeemer. Amen. So I remember something very clearly at the start of my seminary journey. Our Dean of Student Life and Community Living, Dean Asa Lee, who is actually now the president of Pittsburgh Theological Seminary, had all of us incoming students look at chapter 18 in the Gospel of Matthew. I can't remember if this was done in our weekly spiritual formation class, a mandatory required class for incoming students, or if it was in the context of our weekly chapel service. But he told us this. He said, chapter 18, if you get lost, contains the blueprint for Christian ethics and Christian living, especially in a community of believers. He said, it's got to be mandatory reading. Not that the entirety of the Bible, the Gospels isn't, but specifically chapter 18 was mandatory reading for anyone wanting to serve in leadership positions in the church, or for anyone who wanted to participate in the life of the church, for that matter. And so if you look with me at the beginning verses in chapter 18 and see what it says, it will be apparent to you why Dean Lee presented this chapter to us in these terms. Because hear what it says right at the beginning. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus and asked, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" He called the child whom he put among them and said, "Truly I tell you, unless you change and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever becomes humble like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever welcomes one such child in my name welcomes me." So believe it or not, even at seminary, a place where you're supposed to go to be trained up as a leader in the church, to become equipped to be a pastor, there was this sense that we were there as competitors rather than companions with one another. If I'm being honest, we were found jostling for who was to be known as the most biblically knowledgeable or the most sophisticated in terms of their theological understandings, who was the best or most fervent prayer warrior, who was doing the most when it came to evangelizing, or spreading the gospel through missions outreach. I was the most zealous missions outreach person. If you couldn't gather by the way we do things here. And I thought, taking all this in, that I had to be cutthroat at law school. Didn't hold a candle to seminary. Looking back on that time, I can see that we were all fighting for that same honored position at the top, at the very head of the table, wanting, like the disciples here at the beginning of chapter 18, to be crowned as the greatest disciple of Jesus. And so perhaps in a not so subtle way, what Dean Lee was trying to do for us was point out that very early in our journey as seminarians, as future leaders and participants in the church, the body of Christ, he's trying to tell us that our way of doing things, our approach to this journey had to be different. You know, if we were to live into this identity as being disciples, followers of Jesus Christ, if we were consecrating ourselves to God through discipleship in Jesus Christ, if we were really to embody what we sang in our opening hymn, take my life and let it be consecrated, Lord, to thee, then the way we acted, our motivations for why we did what we did, had to be conformed to the image and likeness of Christ. Because if we sit and reflect, his way is different from the ways of the world. The ways of the world which I'm pausing for dramatic effect. His way and the ways of the world which are still in contrast. The ways of the world which still pit us against each other. Where we still find ourselves, like everyone else, trying to inch our way forward ahead of the person next to us on this measuring scale, this invisible measuring scale that we're all measuring our worth by. You know? And even in seminary, as we discover that we are trying to outdo each other in terms of goodness or godliness, proving somehow that we were superior, somehow to be found greater. And Jesus is saying in response to the worldly desires of his disciples that they are climbing up the wrong ladder. Those of us who participated in the Falling Upward book series that Pastor Brian led for us in the spring know this, that they were climbing up the wrong wall. Instead of seeking to gratify your own desires, worrying about glorifying yourself by distinguishing yourself from others, seeking to rise above and elevating yourself from the people around you so that you can become Lord over your kingdom. Jesus was trying to say it's the other way around. You have to, as he says in the beginning verses of chapter 18, you have to become like a child. You see, in those days, children weren't as valued and doted upon like Winston has been this morning. Winston's making his first appearance at church, for those of you who are joining in via Zoom. Because in those days, in the ancient world, children were seen as occupying the lowest rung of the social ladder. They had the least amount of clout or status. So what Jesus is saying is unless you become like someone without any power or agency, unless you change and seek solidarity with those who are situated all the way at the bottom and rather than the top, if you aren't aligning yourself with the little ones, then you aren't really walking as my followers. You're not walking in the light that I have come to reveal. Because Jesus is answering this question, which echoes throughout all of time and space. It's a question that is found in the mouth of Cain. The question that is cynically asked in our hearts when we too pull a Lucy on the many Charlie Browns in our lives. You know, pulling the football away just as they're about to kick it. It's this question of, am I my brother's keeper? And Jesus is answering, yes. Yes, you are. Yes, yes, and yes. We're meant to preserve and safeguard each other. Now, that's what we're created to be. As I was preparing for the sermon, I couldn't help but recall the very beginning, the creation story of how Adam and Eve are created. The story says, from the side, the rib, a bone that's not superfluous, but something created from the side. We're meant to be side by side with each other as companions. It's not good for us to be alone. And that's why I think Jesus has such a harsh rebuke. If you continue reading, if you continue with me, he has such a harsh rebuke for those who act as stumbling blocks for the little ones. He says, if you act as stumbling blocks for the little ones, causing others to sin or stumble, it would be better for you if a great millstone were fastened around your neck and you were drowned in the depth of the sea. That's as harsh of an image as you could possibly conjure up. And these are coming from the lips of Jesus, the one who's about love. But that's how dramatic he has to be to get the point across. For us who so frequently see ourselves as competitors rather than companions on our journey of life. He's saying it's not about you do you and I'll do me. It's not about I'll take care of myself and you take care of yourself. It doesn't work like that in the kingdom of heaven. We're meant to be yoked together, bound together with what are cords of love. There's this one for all and all for one component at the heart of Jesus' message. One that is encapsulated in his parable about the shepherd who leaves the 99 to go after the one who has gone astray. You know, I thought it only appeared in Luke. It shows how closely I was reading chapter 18 like Dean Lee prescribed us to read. Because if you continue reading, that same parable appears in this chapter. It says, when the one who strays is found, the shepherd is more overjoyed about the one restored, the one who is reconciled back into the fold, than the ones who had never strayed and had never left. If we think about this, we notice that there's this great attention that's given to and for the dignity of each and every person in God's eyes. No one is the greatest or the lowest. We are all beloved children of God. This is what Jesus is trying to get at. When our minds and our hearts are filled with this question of who is the greatest, or am I my brother's keeper? Does my concern have to go beyond my life? What Jesus is telling us is that this reveals our alienation, our separation, how we are locked in adversarial combat with each other rather than being each other's caretakers. And so this is the context in which we get to our gospel passage for today, which hones in on verses 15 through 20. Starting from verse 15, which reads, "If your brother or sister sins against you, go and point out the fault when the two of you are alone." You know, we live in a world where this prescription is not so commonplace. Out in the world, especially nowadays, everyone's sins are on full display for all of us to gawk at and ridicule. With the advent of social media, with the ubiquitousness of smartphones, our mistakes are captured and amplified for millions of people to see. And that's the first impulse, I think, whenever we are locked in conflict with someone else. These days, the first reaction is for you to grab your camera and hit record, to capture how in the right you are and how in the wrong they are. And now, this isn't to say that these videos haven't served the purpose of bringing to light injustices that used to never see the light of day, particularly the experience of Black and brown people in our society, especially in their relations with law enforcement. But I can't help but escape this feeling that by and large, our use of this new technology to record our conflicts is for the purpose of robbing people of their inherent dignity, to paint the one I'm in conflict with as a villain, deserving our scorn, and in the process, vindicating the person who feels he or she is on the right, the one who stands above, lording over, in the place of judgment, with righteousness on their side, able to be over and against the one who is causing offense. And even if we're not directly involved in that way of conflict resolution, we're all somehow implicated in it. Because since these scenes are captured and shared, we can't help but look. There's this perverse voyeurism that happens when we watch these videos of so-called Karens being taken down for their offensive behavior. You can't help but become filled with righteousness indignation too, because you stand with the one who has the right on their side, also becoming elevated, also becoming greater than the clear villain that is on display for all to see. And what gets lost in this shuffle is the ultimate end for which Jesus is bringing up the process of conflict resolution in the first place. It isn't to establish who is wrong and who is right. It's not to cast stones at the one who is in the wrong. The process is actually meant to result in the restoration of the relationship between the two parties that has become fractured. A relationship that was supposed to be defined as companionship, being with one another, that has been splintered by this conflict. It's meant to regain the one who is lost, is what Jesus says in verse 15. Because if you approach them, preserving their dignity by going up to them as an individual. If they listen to you, you have regained the one who has been lost. As we keep reading, Jesus gets more people involved. If they don't listen to you, but if you are not listened to, take one or two others along with you. Not so that they can also cast aspersions and say, oh, you really screwed up big. But so that they might be used for the purpose of regaining the one who has strayed away. And if then that person still refuses to listen, you get the whole body of believers involved. You get the church. And if the offender refuses to listen even to the church, let such a one be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. You know, those awful sinners that Jesus always hung out with. Saying, treat them as someone that deserves an overextension of love that goes against what your culture and society tells you to do, which is to lord over them, those people who occupy the lowest rung of your society. To not gawk, to not press your own righteousness, to not delight in the wrongness and offensive behavior of others. That's really tough to do, especially if you like watching reality TV, right? And statistics show that 80% of the people who watch TV watch reality TV. Or for those of us who are online watching TikToks or YouTube videos, it is filled with the foibles of people who are doing wrong. People that we can easily laugh at and stand above. And yet, Jesus calls us to be a different people, to walk in his way under the light that he comes to reveal. Because Jesus comes to us not to lord over us, not to say, I am righteous and I stand above you, but rather to be Emmanuel, God with us, in community with us. Not as we would imagine, which would be to elevate and stand above, but on our level, so that we might stand reconciled to the God who seeks to be with us, to become a bridge of reconciliation between us and God, and thereby the means by which we can be reconciled to one another, reconciled to our estranged brothers and sisters, not seeing each other as combatants on this journey of life where we have to fight each other for glory, but rather as companions. And this is the whole tenor of his life, from birth to death. Born into a meek manger rather than the halls of great power, living a life of service, lived out for the sake of others rather than to gratify his own selfish gains, and then dying on the cross. And this is where he leads us. For where 2 or 3 are gathered in my name, our gospel passage ends, I am there among them. And it's not just saying Jesus Christ. I wish Kathy was here because she's talking about how she's reading Harry Potter. It's not a spell that we are casting. We're not saying if you say Jesus Christ 3 times, he's here. It's the name of Jesus Christ means becoming him, identifying with him, and the way he was in solidarity with those who were shunned, with those who were causing offense, with those people like you and me who make every day our birthdays, wanting to selfishly get your way every day. Instead, Jesus calls us to be bound together in cords of love that cannot be broken, because when we seek to live our lives in this way, Jesus will be there amongst us. Let us be a community that embodies and reveals the light and presence of Jesus right here in our midst. Would you join me in singing our hymn of response? Blessed be the tie that binds, found in 557 of your Red Pew hymnals.